We're on the fourth episode of the Mythological Africans deep dive into Jungian archetypes in African myths, legend, and folklore. So far, we've defined key Jungian concepts, introduced the rulership archetype, and used the Sondiata epic from the Malinke people of Mali to explore how that archetype might show up in the case of what would be considered a good king. And themes that emerge from that discussion include the intersection between the hero, magician, and sage archetype with the rulership archetype, and some specifics of Balinke power symbols, including items, plants, animals, and relationships. So we'll remain focused on the rulership archetype for the month of March, and the plan is to look at it from different angles, reason why in this week's episode, we are going to talk about rulership in African mythology and folklore from the perspective of women. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Mythological Africans podcast, where we read and talk about stories from African mythology and folklore. I am your host, Helen Tunde. Jungian scholar Marie-Luise von Franz makes a very interesting statement in the introduction of her book, The Feminine in Fairy Tales. If we look for feminine archetypal models of behavior in fairy tales, she writes, we at once stumble over the problem that feminine figures in the fairy tales might have been formed by a man and therefore do not represent a woman's idea of femininity, but rather what Jung called the anima. Now, if you recall from our previous episodes, the anima is a pillar archetype, that is, a distinct aspect within the human psyche that helps us to relate to, navigate, and make sense of ourselves and the world that we live in. And specifically, the anima refers to the part of a man's psyche or consciousness that is aware of and processes the experience of being a woman. The equivalent of the anima in women is the animus, and the animus would then be the part of a woman's psyche or consciousness that is aware of and processes the experiences of being a man. So it's contrasexual, as the literature says. Basically, the part of you that thinks about and imagines and perceives what it means to be of the opposite sex or gender. And in Jung's theories, the anima is feminine because it develops based on a man's relationship with his mother or other primary female caregivers who shaped his early life, and also according to the conceptions of womanhood in the society that he lives, womanhood or femininity. Meanwhile, the animus is masculine and develops relative to the men who shape a woman's early life and the conceptions of manhood or masculinity in her society. Now, with the understanding that gender is not necessarily a binary, later Jungian scholars and analysts have expanded and better contextualized definitions of the anima and animus such that, the anima is thought of as the reflective principle within the psyche, which takes into account emotions, feelings, empathy, and other such sensitivities. Meanwhile, the animus refers to the active principle in the psyche, which focuses more on intellectual, exploring, seeking, penetrating sides. And they both still relate to gender identity to some extent. And whichever of these two archetypes is active in a person is almost always the opposite to what their embodied gender identity is. And there is complexities to it, which we would really need to do a series on this to tease apart. It's actually something that is evolving as ideas about gender identity and sexuality evolve as well. But what Marie-Luise von Franz is suggesting, and I certainly believe that this is the case in African mythology and folklore, is that we cannot study women in any mythological or folkloric tradition without thinking about the source of their stories, who documented the stories, and the filters whose context these people might be operating within. In the case of African mythology and folklore, the source and the documenters of the texts in circulation, which most of us consult these days when we want to explore these topics, quite often were men. This is not to say that there were or there are no women designated as porters of oral traditions. There are. However, when most of what is available in the written record as African mythology and folklore was originally documented, men played a bigger role than women. So what this means is that we have to maintain the awareness of how the anima projections of these men might be influencing the context of the images, symbols, and patterns that we encounter in oral traditions. And a good example that comes to mind for this, for me, is the case of the foundation legend of the Yaka forest people. There are two versions of that story in circulation, one told by women and the other told by men. But as British anthropologist Jerome discovered while working with the Yaka in the 1990s, most people were not too keen to tell that foundation legend, but women were especially reluctant to tell their version, reason why he had to hear the women's version from a man. So you can imagine the layers to that. Another example of this is the case of Dutch comparative mythologist Mineke Schipper, who did a study of African proverbs and sayings about women, and she noticed the pattern. African oral traditions, most of which were recorded by and from men, had a tendency to vilify women outside of their role as mothers, caregivers, or embodiments of self-sacrifice. So basically, when the story wasn't about how a woman was a mother or a caregiver who was very self-sacrificial, tended not to be very flattering of the women. And she cites the specific case of the work done by Yoruba scholar Adefiowe Oyesakin on Yoruba oral poetry, in which women were constantly blamed for all the ills in the world. As Oyesakin puts it, the intention of that exercise is to cajole women to succumb to the subservient role that society expects them to play and curb the excesses of spurious women so they can conform to societal norms. And also by attacking and condemning the women, they would put the women in a position where they could, not be as open and expressive as they were, and make the women more controllable, essentially. And this is because in the perception of traditional poetry, women were seen as agents of indiscipline in society. There is also the case of Queen Arawelo of Somalia, whose story paints her as a tyrant when told by men, but as a liberator when told by women. And we'll be spending some time with the story of Arawelo in another episode, that's for sure, because that's a classic case of what we might be talking about here. So I want to emphasize that this doesn't mean that the archetypal images, symbols, and patterns that emerge from myths and folktales about African women are wrong. But we do want to maintain the awareness so that we can spot patterns that deserve a second look. And what we'll do is a quick overview of some examples of good rulership in this episode, and then revisit specific examples of bad rulership in men and women rulers in next week's episode. So what does emerge when we look at some stories of African women rulers? And there are many, from myth, from legend, from folklore. So I'll just focus on two examples in today's episode. Now keep in mind that the Jungian framework of rulership is patterns of behavior or circumstances, images, cultural symbols, including people, places, and things that carry the collective memory of what it takes to secure and maintain order, sovereignty, and stability, to create an environment where people can be productive, can work towards their abundance, can live in harmony and unity. The main thing that strikes me when I start looking at rulership in African women from this lens is that often it manifests itself in the context of familial relationship. So you have the queen mother, the chief's sister, the king's wife, or the chief's daughter. And this does not necessarily diminish the role that women play relative to men. Matter of fact, and especially in the context of matrilinearity, these relationships were often the foundation of the male ruler's legitimacy. And then this gave women rulers considerable sway in their ability to flex their own rulership muscle. So some of you might recall that in 2022, I wrote and in 2023 self-published a book titled The Runaway Princess and Other Stories. And this was a collection of short stories based on women and girls from African myths, folktales, and legends. And in that book, I tried to use my understanding of the cultures from which the stories emerged and a liberal sprinkling of creative license to tell these women's stories, but from a more introspective standpoint. So what was driving the decisions that they made? What were they thinking? How were they feeling? The runaway princess referenced in the title is Yenenga. and Yenenga is a legendary princess from the folklore of Burkina Faso's Mosi people. In her story, she is a heroine to her people and a warrior so effective and accomplished and necessary to the kingdom, her father wouldn't let her marry and start a family the way she wanted to. Now, to protest her father's decision, Yenenga plants a farm full of okra plant but doesn't harvest it. She lets it rot and dry out. And her father still doesn't take a hint, so she runs away from the kingdom and on her escape meets a hunter in the forest and marries him and has a son who becomes the founder of the Mosi kingdom. Her son is Wedrago. So the question I keep asking myself as I read Yenenga's story, the question I kept asking myself is whose viewpoint was really being communicated in this account? Because she's a fearless warrior, but also a woman who just wanted to marry and her father wouldn't let her. There are many things you can pull out of that story. But more importantly, what might she have been feeling about it all? What were her motives? So I started thinking about the role that women in traditional African societies might play, what Yenenga might have experienced as both a warrior in her father's army, but as also a member of her community. And the possibility that emerged for me was that what if Yenenga had grown tired of war and bloodshed? What if she had fought so many battles, won so many conquests, that she had started seeing that rulership was not just about conquering and expanding territory, but also about consolidation, creating the bonds and networks necessary to keep that territory you just conquered to begin with, but also to generate stability, unity, and harmony in a way that people would want to live together and work together. This is something that women in the caregiving, caretaker role instinctively do. So in Jungian terms, one might say that Yenenga had integrated her animals, that's the instinct to explore and question and invade and conquer and acquire, with herself as a woman, which leans more towards opening up to understanding, feeling, sensing, and meaning making. And both sides were now working together to balance outward-looking impulses with inward-focused ones. Interestingly, the symbols most commonly associated with Yenenga are the horse and the spear, which are, by and large, male-centric symbols of rulership. The farm and the okra plant, which are a major part of her story, are not usually, seen as symbols associated with her, at least not that I have seen, or connected necessarily with rulership. And there is just a conspicuous absence of anything that speaks to her desire to marry and have children, which alludes more to the community building or productive aspect. Not even as she is dubbed the founding mother of the Mosi through her son Ouedraogo. So it's not necessarily even that she went and conquered and founded the Mosi kingdom. Her son had children, had sons, and they formed the Mosi kingdom. Her founding role was to be the mother of the Mosi kingdom, and yet her positioning as a figure of authority and power is on the horse and the spear, which is true, but that was at the service of her father. In her role for the Mosi kingdom, it would more be in that nurturing role, the fertility, the productivity. Because when you think about it, farms, productive ones at least, are based on collaboration within and between families and whole communities. So to have a successful farm, a productive farm, wasn't a matter of going out and conquering people. It was your ability to work with each other, to organize, to work with the seasons, to put in the necessary work to do your part to create that output that was needed to feed the community. But then there's also the fact that the okra plant specifically, when it bloomed, traditionally was a seasonal indicator of when the harvesting period was near. And also where an okra plant grew abundantly indicated that the soil was particularly fertile. Also, from what I understand, amongst many West African people, okra is used in traditional medicine to support childbearing. So the symbols were right there, right? The symbols were right there. But perhaps because of the framing that rulership took in the minds of the people who documented the story and who transmitted the story, these other symbols that are important to rulership as well, the consolidation, the connection, the creation of circumstances necessary for abundance, those fell to the wayside. Another story, and this one more from history than legend, where relationship in the context of matrilinearity underpins a woman's rulership is the case of Ya Asantewa, who was the Asante Hema or Queen Mother of the Ashanti Confederacy in the early 1900s. And Ya Asantewa is another famous figure in African legend. She became a Queen Mother after her brother, Nana Akwasi Afrane Opese, became the chief of the Edwesu. But she inherited the role of Asante Hema from another woman in her family. So she doesn't become Queen Mother because of her brother. The men from her family can be chiefs because they share the same mothers, grandmothers, and overall matrilineal heritage. So her brother dies and she appoints her grandson Kofi Tene as ruler. And she can do this because as Queen Mother, she is the guardian of the golden stool, the highest symbol of Ashanti rulership. And this was all during the turbulent times of British conquest and Ashanti resistance. And it all comes to a head when the British took some chiefs, her grandson included, prisoner. And the British demanded the golden stool of the Ashanti as a token of their surrender. Now, the remaining chiefs of the Confederacy were afraid of war, but Ya Asantewa basically told them to man up, and she rallied the women of the Confederacy to her cause. She was appointed, the commander-in-chief of the army, and they take on the British. They put on an impressive fight, but they were ultimately defeated since they just didn't have the numbers that the British Empire had. My understanding is the British brought in people from other parts of the African continent and even abroad to come and fight the Ashanti. This war that they fought is called the War of the Golden Stool, or it's also called the Ya Asantewa War, and she is remembered as a fierce defender of Ashanti sovereignty. My understanding, though, is that because power was more or less shared in the Ashanti context, Ashanti women in position of rulership could claim or be bestowed with stools and other symbols associated with rulership on the same scale as men. The material from which these items were made might be what makes the difference. So gold stools are a symbol of male rulership, but the Queen Mother might sit on a stool painted white and adorned in silver and cowries. A Queen Mother can also be carried in a palanquin, like the chief, just perhaps a less elaborate one. And royal women can wear gold artifacts shaped as the moon and the stars and other royal symbols, just as the king would, to signify, their presence everywhere, their dominion, just as the moon and the stars shine on all corners of the earth. As part of the royal family, they would be entitled to wear those as well. It's just they might not be as big or finely rendered as those worn by the king. So in the Ashanti context, when you think about female rulership, the symbols, the images, the patterns of behavior are similar to the men's. And this is something to keep in mind in the African context, is that, the symbols will intersect. It's just the materials out of which they were made or the way they would be rendered might be different. The other thing to keep in mind, and we'll say this before we wrap up for the week, is that rulership symbols, images, and patterns for women in the African context would also intersect with the symbols, images, and patterns ascribed to women in general. But then, since women in rulership positions were considered the epitome of all women, the assignation of these symbols to them was basically an elevation. So if a pot or a hoe or other items associated with domestic life were elevated to royal status, is because royal women, were the chief cook who provided food for all the village, or they were the chief farmer who did the first tilling of the soil and fertilized the soil before the other women of the village or the community could start farming. And this is actually a tradition in some parts of West Africa, specifically Cameroon, where I'm from. So in some traditions, the Queen Mother or the Queen's wife is the person who, when at the start of the planting season, she has her hoe, her ceremonial hoe, and she strikes the first soil. She breaks the first soil and makes the first bed, and then the farming season is officially launched, and other women can start making their farms. So we will stop here for the week. This was a quick overview of, we can think about it as positive symbols and images of rulership associated with women in the African context. But we will continue next week with this, as well as more archetypal images associated with rulership in the African context, but this time leaning more towards bad rulership. So thank you as always for listening, and I will see you next week.